Hi, and welcome to F-World, the Fragility Podcast. Together with our guests from around the globe, we explore how fragility manifests across economics, politics, culture, development, and the environment, and how we can build a more resilient future. My name is Paul Biska. I'm your co-host, together with Michaela Karste and Johan Bjurman-Bergman. And today, we are speaking with our guest, Dr. Shanta Devarajan, who's a professor of practice of development at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. Before joining Georgetown, Shanta had a distinguished career at the World Bank, with stints including Senior Director for Development Economics, also known as DEC, Acting Chief Economist for 3 regions in the World Bank, Middle East and North Africa, Africa, and South Asia, as well as for the Human Development Network. Among many other things, Shanta was the director of the World Development Report 2004, Making Services Work for the Poor. Before 1991, he was on the faculty of Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. His research comprises over 150 publications on public economics, trade, policy, natural resources and the environment, and general equilibrium modeling of developing countries. Born in Sri Lanka, he studied math at Princeton and got a doctorate in economics at UC Berkeley. Shanta, welcome to F-World.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here. Nice to be with you.
Thank you so much. So we want to start this conversation with a question we ask all of our guests, because we want people to know who are those working on development, fragility, conflict. So tell us a bit about your story. Where did you grow up? You studied math at Princeton. You got your PhD in economics in Berkeley. Tell us a bit about your formative experiences and what led you to be interested in fragility.
Oh, okay. It's a long story. I'll try to make it very brief. Yes, as you said, I was born in Sri Lanka. We moved to New York City when I was 8 years old. My parents joined the UN. So I grew up in New York and then in Switzerland because we moved to Geneva when I was in high school. So I went to international schools throughout my formative years and then went to Princeton. And as you said, studied math. But I have to say, towards the end of my time at Princeton, I was getting more interested in the application of mathematics than pure mathematics. And my advisor happened to be a professor in both economics and mathematics. So he said, well, why don't you look at economics, which I did, and I really liked it. So that's when I ended up doing my PhD at Berkeley in economics. But still, at that time and the way I was, I think it was still very theoretical economics. I did a dissertation on natural resources, but it was about the uncertainty in resource stocks and how that affects resource strategies, a purely theoretical piece. But then my first job was teaching at the Kennedy School at Harvard. And that's when I began to confront the policy aspects of what I was teaching. Because even though I was teaching microeconomics to the students kept asking me, why do we need to learn this? What's the application? And that forced me to actually confront that question and come up with applications and start working on those things. And as a result, I myself got very interested in those applications and started following it. And then given my background in developing countries, my father was at the UN and grew up in that environment, I started looking at the applications of economics in development. And that's how I then ended up at the World Bank. And then so the fragility aspect actually came up when I was at the bank, after I'd been at the bank for about 9 or 10 years. And it was a very interesting anecdote, if you like, because this is sort of how it really got started at the bank as well. We used to have an annual meeting where we would review the countries that had performed particularly badly. We would review all countries, but we would pay a lot of attention to a country that had performed particularly badly in the past year in terms of their economy and poverty reduction and things like that. And it struck me that it was every year, it was the same countries that were on the list. And we would say, oh, we have to do better with Burundi, next year. And then you go, next year, Burundi is still on the list. And that's what got me thinking. And I remember talking to Paul Collier about this, because Paul was the director of the research department at the time. Saying, there's something going on here. that why are these countries the same ones that are on the list? There'll be some countries that join the list, but very few leave the list. And that's when we started thinking that there may be something unique or distinctive about these countries.
So this is a great headway to one of the questions I wanted to ask you. I mean, there's many of them. I would absolutely love to ask you to make the pitch for economics that you would make for the students. Not necessarily as a way to understand fragility, but we can talk about this. But tell us a bit about the paper that you wrote in 2011. It was about the escaping the fragility trap. And what is fragility to you? We want to know, I mean, both of you are training as an economist from the experience you've gathered. How do you define that term?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll tell you about the paper, because that actually then gets us to the fragility. And that, again, was as a result of experience. At that time, I was the chief economist for the sub-Saharan African region. And there, what I noticed was that, we would allocate aid based on research that I and others had done, based on the quality of policies and institutions in countries. And there were a group of countries, which were these fragile states, where the policies and institutions were terrible. That's one of the reasons they were fragile states. But as a result, they got very little aid. And that then led to a syndrome where countries would be doing very badly. They get even less aid because they were doing badly. So they would do even worse the next year. And then they would get even less aid. And you would get into this syndrome where, there might be a situation where they were caught in a trap. And I remember, the country that where this came home to me was Guinea-Bissau. It's a small country, perennially in fragility, and was getting just a piddly little amount of aid. And they were having, serious problems, say, with electricity. They needed very little money to rebuild the electricity plant, the one electricity plant in the country. But they didn't have enough money, and so the power kept going out. And, of course, that makes it easier for rebels to run around and shoot people. And that just kept getting worse. So I began to think, and on the positive side, that maybe this way of allocating aid had a problem with it, even though, as I said, I contributed to the analytical foundation, so I think it was well versed on strong foundations. But there may be a problem, which is we should be thinking, for these countries, we should be thinking of aid not necessarily as just allocating it where it's most productive, but rather think of it as taking a risk. It's a bit like venture capital. So with Guinea-Bissau, if we continue to allocate aid the way we normally do, they'll never grow. So why don't we just take a gamble and put a lot of money into Guinea-Bissau? And that still may not work. But if it does work, that will get them out of this trap. And that's the way in which we evolved this idea of the fragility trap, that too many countries were faced with this syndrome of getting caught in a trap. And if you continue business as usual, they were not going to get out of the trap. That's the sense in which it was a trap. Now, what that says about fragility is that these are countries, is really how they got into the trap in the first place. Because then you start looking at how they ended up in the situation. These are countries where the system of governance was so weak that the state had no longer was able to provide basic security to its public. Now, and that's sort of a fundamental function of the state. But the truth is that if the state is unable to provide basic security, chances are it's unable to provide a lot of other things, like basic education or health or water or sanitation. And that's why the fragility is really a syndrome of a complete breakdown of the institutions that make a state function.
It's interesting you mentioned Guinea-Bissau as a perennial example. At some point, when I was looking at security spending in Guinea-Bissau, I discovered that in the early 90s, I think there were about 5 generals or something like that in the army. And by the early 2000s or mid 2000s or something, there were like 45 or something.
50.
So it's clearly money is being spent, but the value for money is not there. So
well, and also, I mean, you know, the other side of Guinea-Bissau is that it's become a narco state. I mean, the drugs come in from Latin America, and they're transferred to Europe through Guinea-Bissau. I mean, I remember when I was chief economist, there was a situation where they were going to investigate one of the airplanes in the airport, and before the investigators came, they blew up the plane.
Were you at the
blew
airport?
it up in the airport. They literally, it was parked. It was in a hangar. I mean, it wasn't flying, but they exploded. I mean, so think about that. That's a $40 million plane. So the stuff in there was probably worth more than $30 or $40 million.
So I've asked you many questions already. If it's up to me, I could ask all day, but I'm sure my 2 co-hosts have ideas as well. So who would like to take a risk, as Shanta mentioned about investing in fragile states, and ask questions? I think Mihail is next.
So Shanta, you gave us a definition of fragility that's a bit more narrowly focused. It's focused on providing security and other services. Could you elaborate a bit more? I'm very curious about what other dimensions of fragility should we be considering in order to actually understand what's going on in the world today?
Okay, so there's always this tension, because if the broader you make the definition, the harder it is to then pin down particular solutions. But I think that's part of this syndrome, the phenomenon. So the working definition of fragility is what I mentioned earlier, which is that the state is not able to provide basic security to its citizens. But there are many ramifications of that. One is the state is unable to provide other basic services like education and health and water and sanitation. But the other is that means if the state is not providing basic security, that means that in the eyes of the citizens, the state has lost legitimacy. So fragility is also a perception from the point of view of the people in the country. And that's very important, because it's not necessarily what we think from outside the country, although, you know, we're the ones who produce the fragility indices and and things like that. It's really that once the citizens are doing things going around the state or trying to undermine some of the excesses of the state, then you're in a fragile situation, whether we observe it from our indicators or not.
This is so interesting what you just said about fragility being also a point of view, a perception of the citizens within a country. If we're going to apply that dimension of fragility, then all of a sudden the concept expands to places like the Western world, United States, Western Europe. These are not countries and places we traditionally think of as fragile, not even in Eastern Europe. However, if we're looking at it through the lens of losing trust in the state, citizens losing faith in the state, then all of a sudden fragility is far broader than our traditional list of fragile and conflict-affected states.
And by the way, I think we have to be very clear. Fragility is not a black or white thing. I mean, it's not like yesterday you were not fragile and today you're fragile, right? It's a continuum. And there are different degrees of fragility, which is sort of different degrees of the probability that you might erupt into violence and civil conflict. And so several countries, several rich countries have been moving down that scale. In fact, even in the list that the World Bank produces, some people at the World Bank produce. I don't think it's part of the official list, but there are people who produce these fragility indices as a continuum in terms of the probability of eruption to civil war. And the United States has been dropping in that indicator They don't publicize it very widely, but again, as you said, the people living in the U.S. Have already felt it. The other thing and this came home to me when I was in the MENA region. I seem to sort of end up in all these fragile situations. But in the MENA region, think about it, these were not low-income countries. These were middle-income countries. And yet, the other phenomenon in MENA was that it's not just one country or two, it was the whole region was fragile because of the spillover effects. So you had a civil war in Syria, but that created fragility in Lebanon or created problems in Iraq. We have to get out of this idea that fragility is something that only affects the very poor countries. It's everywhere, including in very rich countries.
Most definitely, and let's stick around there in the MENA for just a little while longer, because as you were part of the team or led the team, perhaps even producing the WDR 2011, which was on fragility, I was actually studying Arabic in Damascus, in Syria, right as this was unraveling. And I know we've talked a lot about before how even the most well-informed institutions in the world, such as the World Bank, missed the signs that were all around. And I know myself being in Syria, in 2010, I think Syria had welcomed more tourists than Australia. And the following year, it went to zero. And the year after that, it was complete civil war. So as we now, celebrate or at least mark 10 years since the start of the Arab Spring and the publication of the WDR, how has your thinking around fragility and conflict changed over this time, and specifically informed by those learnings you might have taken away from the experience with the Arab Spring?
Absolutely. And I think you were right to say that not just the World Bank, but I think the whole international community was caught quite unawares of the Arab Spring. And this comes back to the point about listening to the citizens of the country rather than our perceptions, because the indicators that we observe normally, things like growth and poverty and even income distribution, were all improving for the whole decade prior to the Arab Spring, during the decade of the 2000s. In fact, I remember the IMF had a conference called Tunisia, a Model Country, in October 2010. Now think about that. That was 1 month before the guy put himself on fire in Tunisia. Right? They didn't invite him to the conference. But that's the essence of the disconnect that we were facing. And so I am, not just now, but I mean, over this period, what we realized was, first, we have to listen to the public. Because there were certainly voices in Tunisia, in fact, pointing out that this decline in inequality was misleading, because the way it happened was that it was squeezing the middle class. See, what was happening in Egypt and Tunisia and many of these countries was that the poor were doing a little bit better, the rich were doing very much better, and the middle class were becoming poorer, which meant they were looking more and more like the poor. So inequality was going down in that sense, because the middle class and the poor were more equal to each other, but it was going down for a bad reason. So it tells me that there are different ways in which we should be measuring and monitoring economies if we want to really capture what's going on, and some of our traditional indicators may actually give us misleading results. I mean, and the best example there is, again, the MENA region, because while all of these indicators were favorable in the 2000s, if you look at the happiness indicator that the Gallup poll evaluates, MENA was the unhappiest region in the world. And the happiness indicator was going down in those 4 countries where the Arab Spring took place. They were going down fastest. So we're now trying to monitor that on a regular basis, along with others. But the other aspect, and this is, again, maybe telling a few truths out of school, but it's already out there in the public domain.
Go for it.
The other aspect is that I frankly think we did have some of this information even before the Arab Spring. We had done work on cronyism in Tunisia and Egypt in the 2000s, but we didn't publish it, and we didn't talk about it. Why? Because the governments in power, who were the ones guilty of the state capture, basically threatened the World Bank to say, look, you publish this and you can kiss your country office goodbye. Right? Now, the problem is, therefore, when the Arab Spring came and these dictators were thrown out, and then we did publish these results, the public said, why didn't you publish this 5 years ago? We knew this was there. You had done the analysis. Why didn't you tell us? And we explained it to them. They then turn around and say, so then why should we believe you now? If that's what guides what you do, your credibility is shot. And I mean, as I said, this is all in the public domain, because there was a case where, the World Bank had a program where we funded NGOs, and we funded this really good NGO in Tunisia that did a lot of this transparency work. And when they received the award, they returned it. They said, we don't want to be associated with the World Bank because of its lack of transparency. And we're a transparency organization. We can't accept the award. So we do a lot of damage in the long term to us and to the people in the country by suppressing information.
I actually have a follow-up on that. The people I've worked with at the World Bank are some of the most dedicated people I've ever met. Genuine passion for the countries they work in. They put up crazy hours of work. So why do you think this happens? And I'm wondering here if you can speak about, because you mentioned the perception of the people. So listen to the perceptions of the people. It's almost like depending on your profession or even your temperament, you may be inclined to look for different indicators on what goes right or what goes wrong. So what you hinted at right now was this role of knowledge and building credibility and building a sort of it's almost an instrument for building an honest relationship with wider stakeholders than just the government. Can you tell us a bit about why sort of maybe some of the disconnects that happen here? Because I think it's important to say also that a lot of this, at least this is my view, is the result of maybe biases that we all have depending on how we're trained. So or our professional experience or so on. So it would be great if you can shed some light about that.
Yeah, no, I've thought about it and agonized over this for a long time. And, I think it boils down to one very simple point. The World Bank has a knowledge relationship with a country. It also has a financial relationship with a country. But the financial relationship has to be with the government, by definition, by the Articles of Agreement, because they're the only ones who can pay the World Bank back. Right? There's nothing to say that the knowledge relationship has to be exclusively with the government. The knowledge relationship is with the public. But because the financial relationship is with the government, inevitably everybody thinks that the knowledge relationship is also with the government. When we refer to, we as in when I was at the bank, we would refer to the client. It's frequently they're thinking it's the government. And I kept having to say, no, the client are the poor people in the country. The government is an intermediary. And sometimes not a very, very good intermediary. And particularly in some of these fragile states. So it's a very difficult balancing act, because if you've got this financial relationship with the government, how far can you push outside of the government to get knowledge to the public. But I think we have to be very clear that every time we compromise that second function, we are actually undermining our effectiveness.
So I wonder if we can expand the definition of the client so that when it comes to knowledge, the client also includes us, the citizens of donor countries, and actually people from around the world, not just the client country government or its citizens. Ultimately, this knowledge is a global public good. And my question would be, how can we make this information free and open so that it's not hidden at the whim of some captured or corrupt government?
No, I would fully agree, and that's why I kept insisting that the client is the public in the country. Now, I don't want to say that the U.S. taxpayer or the Swedish taxpayer or whatever is a client. They are part of the movement to try to make the world a better place for those poor people living in Africa or wherever, right? So I think we're all on the same page there. The question is, are we faithful to that objective? And I think there are many ways in which we slip in terms of that objective. I mean, one is, and this is no secret either, the U.S., even responding to its taxpayers, sometimes has other objectives, national or parochial objectives, with the World Bank, with World Bank assistance. And go back to what happened after the Iraq War. For evidence. And that, by the way, has created a few decades of fragility in Iraq. So we can go there if you like. But the question is to keep that objective always in your mind, because I think when we compromise by suppressing information or refusing to release information, we are shortchanging that objective. And that's, it's a very hard thing for a bureaucracy to accept, because it's so much easier in a bureaucracy to stop a publication than to release a publication. It's almost like it's asymmetric. I mean, I can even tell you the number of times when the communications department of the bank stopped a publication of mine. And I like to think that I'm fairly sensible. It's not like I'm some kind of reckless crazy. And they don't necessarily appreciate the costs of doing so. That's why I really think, because to them, the bureaucratic costs of having released a publication, because then somebody gets upset. And by the way, I've had cases where I have released a publication, or they have published something of mine, and the president or prime minister or finance minister of the country has called up the president of the World Bank to say, you should fire this guy. This is irresponsible. To their credit, the presidents of the World Bank, and there are like 2 or 3 different presidents, I mean, this happened like once every 2 or 3 years, have defended me. I mean, they've seen what's true. But you wonder how many of those other people, how many people have been, either they have been reprimanded or they self-censor, knowing that if this comes up, that there would be trouble. When I get a call from the president of the World Bank, I do worry a little bit. What did I do?
But I have a question about that. Have you ever stopped a publication from going, and why?
Here's to me, I stop a publication if I'm not convinced that the analytical basis is solid. So, there are many times. And then, I've not stopped a publication, but I have revised it or reformed it, because researchers are people like yourself, they try to they tried to be provocative. I mean, I remember a case where there was a perfectly good paper, but the title was very provocative. And when I consulted with the country director before publishing the paper, he said, look, I don't have anything wrong with the paper, but really this title is going to create headlines unnecessarily. So we just changed the title, So these are all judgment calls you have to make. But then you don't. But I refused to stop a publication that people were trying to get me to stop because there was a footnote on page 10 of the paper that they thought some NGO might pick up on and misinterpret and think we're saying something else, and that would get us into trouble. So, I said, come on, that's not a good reason. That doesn't make any sense.
But I think this is really important because what you've mentioned just now is that we should go beyond this dichotomy of large bureaucracy trying to stop publications, government trying to collude somehow, and then so in a way everyone can be a good guy and a bad guy in the story. And so it's a very interesting point you just made. I know Johan has a question, but please go ahead and then we go to Johan.
No, and also let's think of, we talk about the public out there. They're not a uniform, homogeneous group. So there are factions within the public, and you have to be very careful not to be captured by one of them as well. Just one other thing, what we used to do, we should write reports during electoral campaigns in various countries. And the one thing I would insist on when I was chief economist was that we share those reports with the opposition, with all the parties. And we used to literally go and give presentations to the opposition party while they were doing the campaign. And sometimes they got elected, so they really appreciated it when we gave them.
I think that's fascinating. There's so many insights and learnings that we're just collecting as we're talking here, both from the work you mentioned, learnings from Iraq. I know you've done a lot of work on that, and also when it comes to knowledge products and the relationship with governments. And I think one particularly interesting location that I know that you worked on is South Sudan. Because obviously, as one of the newest countries, really the first country to be born after the shift of the millennium, at least in Africa, it was in some ways a new opportunity to apply a lot of the insights and learnings that several decades of work on fragility had yielded. But also in the context of your recent just comment here on the relationship with the government, there's also a new relationship with the new government. So what were some of the challenges and some of the opportunities that you saw, both in applying the learnings when it comes to a more strategic and operational side, but also in the relationship building and the collaboration aspect of that?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean that was a very special relationship, which, by the way, continues. I'm actually doing some work on South Sudan as we speak. So my initial interest, I happened to be the chief economist of Africa at the time, and so this was, I added one more country to my list of 45 countries. So I was quite excited about that. But and the other was a personal point, which is, I'm a Sri Lankan Tamil. And so in some sense, my people tried to do what the South Sudanese did, but they failed. The South Sudanese succeeded. So I wanted to sort of see this particular example of a secession and see whether it can work or not. And then the other point, which is what you mentioned, which is that this was the first country in about 50 years to gain independence. So, and we have learned quite a lot about development in the last 50 years. And so can we bring together all of that knowledge to bear on this country? And so there was quite a lot of enthusiasm, and we spent a lot of time with training the people. Now, keep in mind that the new government most of these people were guerrilla fighters since they were about 12 years old. So they really had very little formal education, even. And so they, and in many cases, they were relying excessively on foreign advisors and so on. But I think that was not the big, and as you know, the outcomes have not been very favorable. I mean, South Sudan has gone back into a civil war. And I think there were maybe 2 points that we didn't appreciate. I mean, we knew it was there, but I don't think we as in the international community didn't quite appreciate. One is the degree of ethnic tension within the South Sudanese population. So you had Nuers and you had Dinkas, and you have very different groups. And in some sense, while they were part of the liberation struggle, those differences were papered over. But once they became a country, they rose to the surface. The second, which again I have been writing about and talking about for a while, was the whole influence of oil. This was an oil. Oil is 90% of the economy there, but the real problem is that what oil did was make it enabled the politicians not to be accountable to the public, because they didn't have to raise taxes. They had this money coming straight in. So they didn't have to really be scrutinized by the public as to how they spend it. And so that's why in fact, in South Sudan, I've been trying, I'm still trying, to develop this idea of distributing oil revenues as cash transfers to the public as a way of making them accountable, so that then they'll have to tax them. And I remember having this conversation with some parliamentarians, and one of the parliamentarians, I was talking to him, and I said, "Which district are you a member from?" And he mentioned some district, and I said, "Oh, I've never been there." And he goes, "Oh, I haven't been there either." He represents this district, but he has no reason to go there. Because they don't pay him. The oil money pays him. And that tells you what the state of accountability is in this situation. And that's what we need to correct, because there's just too much at stake in this nascent country for it to let it go.
Absolutely. And so just drilling a little bit more into this, because I feel like there might be a very interesting interplay between this kind of ethnic split that has become more and more pronounced. Even I know the President Salva Kiir had a speech just after independence where he said, we're Nuer, we're Dinka, but first of all, we are South Sudanese. But that obviously over time has kind of receded. How do you think the taxation could, if you think so, could help move a country together and kind of create that coherence within a society? Because I know this from Sweden, there's some interesting historical evidence from the 1500s when we were small, tribals, and then brought together several ethnic groups. How do you think that can be a way of helping a country unite?
Just to say, a Swede asking a question about taxes is, I think, perfect.
Yeah.
Don't we love them?
Well, there are 2 parts to that. The first, and this is not just South Sudan, but places like Iraq as well, or Nigeria for that matter. Whenever you have a situation where the oil is collected or extracted in just one corner of the country, or one part of the country, and yet it's the way to service the whole country, there's a whole issue of how do you distribute the oil revenues. And in Nigeria, they've had problems with that for 40, 50 years because they kept having its formula. But the formula had different components to it, the population and everything else. But one part of the formula is that each state got a particular lump sum as well, which of course then led to a proliferation of states. Various states started splitting up because they would get this lump sum. So Iraq is having the same problem. In Iraq, the Kurdish area is basically saying, well, the amount of oil money we collect is about the same as what we get as transfers from the center. So why don't we just keep the oil money here? So that's why I've been insisting that the transfer of oil revenues be on a per capita basis. Every individual gets something, rather than the state or the district or the municipality gets something. Because once you do it by states and districts and municipalities, you can start seeing all the jockeying going on between municipalities or within municipalities. Here, if it's every individual, it doesn't even matter where you live. You just get it. That's on the one hand. Then on taxation, that's a very good point, and actually Sweden is a good example of this, because taxation is more than just citizens funding the government. It's a demonstration of solidarity. It's saying we are willing. As an individual, I'm willing to pay a tax that will help you. It may not just help me; it'll also help you. So it's a way of signaling that this is a community rather than it's a series of individuals. Now, it's a very hard transition to make, but you're certainly not going to make it if you don't have to rely on taxation. So that's why I think that sort of introducing taxation, you look at it, there's hardly any taxation in South Sudan because they don't need it. So if you transfer the oil money so that they have to rely on taxes, that might actually help create that solidarity that comes with taxation.
So it's so interesting. This notion of taxation as a potential tool for solidarity is a very interesting way to think about the role of trust in helping alleviate some of the various situations of fragile states. Because ultimately, in order for any agent, whether it's an economic agent or just a citizen, to engage in that kind of solidarity, they have to have the trust that that action will be reciprocated. For example, that distribution of oil revenues is going to be done fairly rather than end up in some offshore bank account of a government official. So how do we think about trust in these situations? How do we build trust? How is it earned?
No, I think it's a fundamental point in economics as well. Actually, we have to be thinking about all the things we do now that undermine trust. And one of them, this is controversial, I get a lot of flack when I point this out, but is the whole system of subsidies that we have woven into our social fabric in various countries, particularly oil-rich countries. And take, we don't have to only talk about fragile states, but take an extreme version, which is something like Kuwait, which is a rich, very stable country, but it's an oil-rich country. And the trust problem is that Kuwait distributes its oil revenues to its citizens using fuel subsidies and public employment. Something like 95% of the labor force is employed in the public sector, and they have huge fuel subsidies. Now, first of all, this is like about the most inefficient way to distribute oil revenues, because fuel subsidies create pollution and congestion, all sorts of other problems, and public employment, they're not very productive. It's just not a good way to do it. But the real thing is, the sign it sends the Kuwaiti citizen is, if you want to get a benefit from the state, you have to consume fuel. And the more fuel you consume, the more benefit you get, right? So it's saying we don't give you the right to choose how you want to spend your benefits. We are deciding how you spend your benefits. If you switch from that to a lump sum transfer, that is actually giving agency to the individual, which is, again, saying that the government trusts you to spend it in your best interest. And in fact, the empirical evidence is that people do spend it on their own best. I mean, the rhetoric in the newspapers is things like, oh, well, they'll spend it on alcohol and cigarettes. And actually in South Sudan, they said that, oh, they'll spend it on another wife. But I didn't want to discuss whether that was a productive or unproductive investment. But the truth is that, I mean, the empirical evidence is that when you give poor people cash, they spend it on the education of their children, or investing in their house, or investing in their business. All right. So we have evidence there. So if they are responsible, why not trust them? Let them do it.
So this immediately makes me think about UBI, especially in the Western world, and not just as a means of helping those most in need, but actually as a means of building trust and a stake in society that we live in. So any thoughts on UBI, on whether or not it's feasible and sort of where it's going would be great to hear. It may not be the closest topic to fragility, but I find it usually underappreciated.
No, it's very, very much connected to fragility. I mean, that's why I'm saying this is it. I am proposing UBI for South Sudan. That's where I want to go. And the other thing, and this comes back to the trust that you mentioned, Mihaela, which is, will it get stolen? Will it get sent to Swiss bank accounts or whatever? It turns out that today, with the technology we have, we actually can verify and protect those cash transfers down to the individual level. So in India, they have this Aadhaar card, which is an iris-identified cash card. It's a debit card. And you can transfer the money electronically, and it goes to your debit card, and nobody, unless they steal your eyes, nobody can impersonate you with that card. Right? And the other thing is you can do it instantly. And in India, they've rolled it out for 1 billion people. So it's not like it's that difficult to do it for a billion people in Africa.
So I actually wasn't aware of that cash card. And it immediately made me think, as I was listening to you, that it could also help address some of the inequities in the distribution of resources to women and to others that lack power in those societies.
That's right. It goes to every individual. So the woman has a cash card and the man has a cash card. And there's some evidence that this has actually empowered women in the bargaining inside the household. In fact, there was a PhD dissertation that I was one of the examiners for, which showed that the program in India actually helped reduce domestic violence. When the husband knows that the wife actually now has this cash, and he needs it to run the household, he's less likely to beat her, basically.
And she's actually able to walk away if she needs to.
That's right. And she has the outside option.
I have one last question for now, at least. When we think about countries, we tend to think at the macro level, but fragility seems much easier to notice at the micro level, at the person, human level. What do you think about the links between macroeconomic policy and fragility? And sort of what's your take on how macro policy interacts with fragility?
Some of it is what we were talking about earlier in terms of aid allocation and so on. But yeah, I've been thinking a little bit more about that in the context of IMF programs in fragile states and so on, because many of these countries have their backs up against the wall in terms of macroeconomic balances, and we know that certainly the Yemen civil war started the day after they cut fuel subsidies as a part of an IMF program. Now, correlation is not causation, so there are not a lot of other things going on in Yemen. Let's be careful about that. But there's certainly something about the role of macroeconomic austerity or fiscal austerity and its fragility consequences. Now, where I'm thinking about this is on the other side, which is in post-conflict situations, the IMF, comes out with these reports, and now the IMF has a new deputy director for fragility, conflict, and violence, who's a good friend of mine. But when I look at their macro analysis of post-conflict situations, they are looking favorably upon those countries that have been able to increase taxes and reduce fiscal deficits. Because in general, that's a good thing. And these countries, right? But you have to really ask yourself the question, how do you increase taxes and reduce fiscal deficit? It's basically fiscal austerity. Now, if you're in a country where these people have been devastated from a civil war, and they're very poor, and the economy isn't growing, and everything's at a standstill, is this the highest priority? Is to reduce the fiscal deficit? Maybe you should sustain a high fiscal deficit for a few years. Again, this comes back to the venture capital idea, right? You give aid to the country and let them get off the ground, because they may still be in a fragility trap. Just because the peace agreement has been signed doesn't mean they're out of the woods.
Yeah, they can actually go right back into conflict.
They can go right back, as they have done. So we have to really rethink macroeconomic policy, the sort of standard precepts of macroeconomic policy, in the context of post-conflict, or in the context of fragility. I think that does require some rethinking.
So that's incredibly interesting, because I know you're an advocate of really thinking also not just about the development outcomes, but as you say, about the peace and stability as a central part of any development strategy, and particularly any strategy to counter fragility. So how can we, through these policies, counter both, and I know you mentioned and talked about prevention before, but also prevention after conflict, so that it doesn't go into a relapse, as you were saying. What are some of the essential policies, measures that governments with very limited capacity can take to prevent conflict, both before its outbreak, but also to prevent recurrence?
Yeah, so, see, I think it depends also, and that's why I've been pushing the students in my class, of whom you are one, to concentrate on the causes of the conflict. Because it depends on what caused the conflict in the first place. Because the way to avoid a conflict, the recurrence of conflict, is not to recreate the conditions that caused the conflict in the first place. But unfortunately, I mean, that seems obvious. You're all nodding your heads. But it's amazing how quickly we forget that in a post-conflict situation. Let me give you an example. Syria, right? There's huge devastation of infrastructure as a result of the war. Hospitals, schools, bridges, roads, everything has been destroyed, right? So when there's a peace agreement, the first instinct is, let's rebuild the infrastructure. And you see there's a ton of money that'll come in from all corners, and it will be rebuilt from a central government run institution. Now, if you realize that the problem that led to the Syrian conflict was this excessive power of the central government, then all you're doing is strengthening that central government one more time and recreating the conditions for a replay of the conflict. But you can imagine that the donors, I'm sure the World Bank is just ready to go in there with a big infrastructure program and rebuild the infrastructure. I'm even not sure that you should rebuild the same infrastructure that was destroyed. Because remember that one thing that has happened in Syria is that half the population has been displaced. Now, one of the reasons they were displaced, one of the reasons they've moved, is because their neighbors were shooting at them. Right? Now, if your neighbors were shooting at you and you moved, do you really want to go back to where you came from? To that same neighborhood? Right? So they may want to go somewhere else. But if we build the infrastructure there, we're going to essentially force them to move back to the same neighborhood. So again,
or actually, you actually facilitate the relationship between the warring parties. I mean, it's easier for them to actually have conflict. There was a paper on Iraq a few years ago that actually proved the relationship between transport and infrastructure and the conflict you mentioned.
That's right. But remember that that goes both ways. You know, the infrastructure also facilitates rebels' movements. I get this is a good story actually. This is when I was in South Asia, as Chief Economist of South Asia, and we were doing the CPIA, the Country Policy and Institutional Assessment, and Nepal had scored very poorly on rural infrastructure. And their score was very bad. And so they wanted an explanation. And I looked it up, and sure enough, I said, you haven't maintained the rural roads enough, so that's why you score very badly. And the guy looked at me and he said, Shanta, don't you know we have a Maoist rebellion in this country, right? If we maintain the rural roads, the rebels will be in Kathmandu in no time. We are deliberately underinvesting in rural road maintenance as part of our strategy. And they were right. You know, but that's the kind of thing, you know, CPIA tells you one thing and Fragility tells you something else.
So the story makes me want to ask about how we gather and integrate this kind of knowledge into the various products that actually get created inside development institutions. How do we mix the sort of rigorous analytics and knowledge with this kind of local tacit knowledge?
No, I don't think the problem is knowledge. I knew there was a Maoist rebellion in Nepal, right? And the Country Economist knows it even better, right? No, the real problem is that we force people to fit their knowledge to a uniform analytical framework, which is the CPIA. We don't give enough flexibility within that framework for them to use their knowledge. They know fully well what's going on in the country. They just have to almost ignore it in order to fulfill this common analytical framework.
So somebody listening to our conversation will think, okay, so we have to change how we do the analytical framework and include more degrees of freedom, let's say. But what's the counter argument? Because you do need a degree of consistency, maybe we can call it uniformity, in our analytics, in order to be able to draw conclusions, to make judgments, to make comparisons. So how do we think about both sides of this issue?
Yeah, no, I'm not sure you need uniformity in the analysis. You need uniformity in the criteria. So, I mean, what I try to do with all the countries is to say, you know, tell me the story of how what we're doing in this country is going to help development in the country. And we're going to hold you to high criteria in terms of the rigor of that story, to be able to establish a story. But that story could be completely different in Nepal as it is in Sri Lanka, because the conditions are very different. It's a little bit, it's even with projects. I mean, we have supposedly do economic analysis of projects before a project, right? And the trouble is, it becomes such a formulaic exercise that it's almost like checking the box. You know, you go in there, and there's certain there is an analytical framework that you have to put in some numbers and come out with a rate of return above 10%, and then the project goes through. Usually, that economic cost-benefit analysis tells me nothing about what's actually the project is actually trying to do. And you know, they come and see the chief economist when they have a problem, right? So they come and say, you know, I'm having trouble getting my rate of return above 10%. You know, can you help me? You know, thinking that I could sort of do some fancy econometrics and get their rate of return up. So then I say, look, what are you trying to do with this project? And it turns out, you know, they are trying to do some good things. But none of that gets reflected in the cost-benefit analysis. So then they say, okay, let's change the cost-benefit analysis to capture those things that you really want to do, because those actually might be good things to do. Now, we may not be able to quantify them as precisely as we do otherwise, but that's okay. We can work around that, and that's much more important than making up some numbers that'll give you a 10% rate of return.
So I have you're alluding to certain things about how to move beyond fragility and what can be done by institutions. So I had a question about what goes wrong in country strategies and how we can do better country strategies. But I'd like to ask it in a different way. I'd like to ask, if you could think, let's say, you are given absolute powers to do what you want in a particular country. You can pick whichever you want to do the perfect FCV, fragility, conflict, and violence strategy. What would you do? What pitfalls would you avoid? How would you structure that?
Yeah, again, I don't think there's a single formula for all FCV countries. And I'll get back to why I think it's not well, I'll start with that maybe why I think it's not working now. And I think we've talked about this, Paul, before. One of the problems is that many of our country directors have both a fragile state and a non-fragile state in their portfolio. And so there's a tendency not to deviate too much between these two in terms of strategies. I mean, think about it. Like, suppose you have two countries, one of which you're trying to get them to reduce the fiscal deficit, and the other one you're advocating increasing the fiscal deficit. People look at it and say, hey, how can you be both? But the fact is, he's right. That is exactly what you should be doing. But it's very difficult, even psychologically, to balance those two in your head. So my first response would be, you should make country directors exclusively for fragile states. And I, in my more ambitious moments, I said, then you create a vice president just for the fragile states, regardless of what region they're in. If they're in Africa, Latin America, or in Asia, you put them all together, and you have one vice president for fragile states. Because the other thing is, then you also can take this venture capital idea seriously, because that vice president will be held to a different standard, if you like, in terms of the productivity of their investments compared to the vice president who has all these stable East Asian countries. You want that person to take some risks, and you want them to fail. I mean, you can expect them to fail, or you tolerate them their failure, because otherwise you're not taking enough risks. Then what I would do within the country is it's a combination of these things, and it's always a balancing act. In fact, we're going to talk about that in class this afternoon. But it's a balancing act between empowering the public in a way that they can hold governments accountable, but also empowering the government to be able to establish some kind of legitimacy in the eyes of the public. And that's very tricky. Because, remember in Liberia, there was this case where right after the Civil War, the donors didn't trust anybody in the Liberian government to manage the funds appropriately. So they wouldn't give money if it was a Liberian run. So they essentially had a foreigner, who actually is somebody who's a friend of mine, who's a colleague of yours at the World Bank, come in as the manager in the Ministry of Finance to authorize all the expenditures of the program. So this was a line position. It was not an advisory position. This person had signatory authority on expenditures by the Ministry of Finance. It was a huge political risk, and even now, it worked in the sense that in 5 years. They were able to then transfer it to a Liberian, and they actually got the money and they actually were able to spend it, whereas previously they wouldn't. But It's a very tough judgment call, but I think those are the kinds of bold things you need to explore in these extreme situations.
So building on this idea that every fragile state is different, like there's a Russian author that says that Tolstoy, exactly. Every unhappy family is unhappy in their own way. There is also, if we take one step down, we see that within the fragile states, the regions and the districts are also diametrically different. And when we do that, we can also discover that within these seemingly chaotic nations, there are these islands of well-functioning communities. I know we have discussed before Séverine Autesserre's book Peaceland. She looks at several of these in DRC, in Afghanistan, and tries to turn the lens around and say, okay, these countries are largely chaotic, there's largely these fragility issues, but in these communities, they have been able to avoid them. What have they done right, and how can we scale it up? What are your thoughts in how to actually identify, systematize, and scale up these types of working communities?
Yeah, I mean, the other example that I like to use is Somaliland. You've got Somalia, which is a failed state, and has been one for about 30 years, and you've got this one part of Somalia, which is Somaliland, that is run really well. Now, and you try to understand the differences, it really comes down to governance. They have a system of governance that actually has checks and balances all the way through the hierarchy in a way that clearly the rest of Somalia does not. But then the question is, how do you transfer that lesson? I mean, how do you get the rest of Somalia to adopt the system of governance in Somalia? You probably can't. So I'm thinking lately I've been thinking a different way. Let's support that island of stability as much as we can and have them succeed. And that's it, right? Let's not try to say, why can't you be more like them, or, why can't you go, have missions go from one to the other, the knowledge transfer or whatever. Just let's get sure that this place succeeds. And once they succeed, people will start observing the success, and then they might adopt it, and they may not. It may still be that way. We were actually working on this, of course. It didn't end well, but in Yemen, in the province around Hadramaut, which interestingly, among other things, has very low usage of khat. Khat is this sort of drug that is really killing Yemenis, but Hadramaut is pretty much khat-free. And then we were saying, how can we get the rest of them to be more like Hadramaut? But the truth is, let's help Hadramaut succeed, so that we can showcase how much you can get from being khat-free.
So I have one more question. In all of the countries that came up in our conversation today, there's more than just the World Bank and the IMF. There are multiple institutions, different kinds of actors, and sometimes they might actually work at cross purposes and can even make the situation worse. Why is collaboration so difficult, and how can we make it better? What are the 1, 2, 3 things that we could do to get the most out of collaboration?
I'll take a maybe controversial position on this. The reason collaboration is difficult, that answer to your second question, is that these different organizations have different mandates and therefore different objectives. So you can take the classic case of the humanitarian organizations have one mandate and the development organizations have a different mandate, and there's an overlap, but it's not a perfect overlap. So then you find that you run up against a tension, because some people just want to provide food and shelter to those refugees. That's the humanitarian objective. Whereas, say, the World Bank would go in and say, okay, let's find some jobs for them. That actually takes much more and takes different activities from this, and it might take away from the food and shelter objective. We can try to make them collaborate more, but my latest thinking is, why don't we just live with it? Let's accept it, that there's going to be this tension. There's going to be some, there's some collaboration already, and there's going to be some difference in objective. Let's be explicit about it. Let's acknowledge that they're on a different mandate, and see how we can each do our job better. I somehow, frankly, feel that we spend this is even more. We probably spend too much time trying to collaborate across institutions rather than getting on with our individual missions, which are really important.
So Shanta, I'm very much aware that we're approaching the end of our conversation. I wanted to ask you a quick question before we wrap it up. What are the 1-2 things about working on fragile states and conflict, or on fragility in general, that you wish you would have known starting in this field, when you moved from the theoretical economics to the practical aspects of policy? What is the one thing that you would tell your younger self?
2 of those things I've already alluded to. I mean, the concept of a fragility trap and the idea of venture capital for fragile states was not only something I didn't know, but in fact, all of my work up to that point was pointed in the opposite direction, because I was doing all this work on aid effectiveness and governance and the importance of governance for aid effectiveness. But I think with fragile states, that actually was an excessive emphasis. Even though we realize that the governance is the most important thing, it's just how do you get that governance to improve might actually involve different things. And the second is maybe rethinking the whole macroeconomic framework for fragile states. And that has quite a few implications. Actually, I mean, this again is something we had a dialogue about. I mean, Iraq was another example, right? So, during the peak 2014, and the peak of ISIS and oil prices crashing down, Iraq was really in trouble, deep trouble. Plus, of course, all the wars going on around the country. So we decided, correctly in my view, that Iraq should get some budget support to be able to keep the place functioning, because otherwise it could really collapse. And of course, if Iraq collapses, the whole Middle East collapses with it. But in our typical fashion, we said, well, if there's budget support, there has to be some policy reforms. So we should now have them do some civil service reform or electricity pricing tariff reform and things like that, because otherwise it's a quote weak program. We can't just give them a blank check. And I had to step in and actually say, no, this is a time when we do have to give them a blank check. I coined the phrase that there are 2 kinds of development policy operations. There's budget support and life support. This is life support. And for those, you don't expect them to do some major institutional reform that they haven't been able to do for the last 25, 30 years, suddenly on this aspect. So we have to really rethink this whole approach to macroeconomic policy and macroeconomic aid, or aid to support macroeconomic policies, very differently in some of these extreme cases.
So Shanta, that is a really thoughtful way to end our conversation. Thank you so much for joining GovWorld. We definitely hope that you will give us some blank checks in future conversations. Just quickly, by way of summary, we've talked about many things.
So you're saying you're a fragile state, right?
Aren't we all to some extent? But just to highlight some of the many things we talked about. First, the fact that fragility is a continuum. There's a fragility trap, and that it's everywhere. It can be in the Western world. It can be in different countries. No country is immune to it. So we have to be careful how we can prevent that. the importance of listening to the people, not just the government in fragile states, the fact that knowledge has a really important role to play to build trust and credibility between international actors and people on the ground, the unique role of macroeconomic policy in fostering communities. Even taxation can actually help, which maybe for some of our listeners and viewers might be a strange thing to think about, but it's true. The importance of an economic order between different groups achieving a common consensus, as you talked about South Sudan, and the way of being maybe more mission-focused and allow maybe a greater need of chaos on the ground between different actors who are trying to achieve the same thing. Thank you again for all your insights and for the anecdotes you shared with us. Thank you also for tuning in to F-World, the Fragility Podcast. We hope you found our conversation interesting and inspirational. Please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to know more about F-World, please visit our website, f-world.org, and follow us on Twitter at F-World Podcast. Thanks for listening.